Oh?
Kalau nasinya kan dia mau minta masakin orang masjid gitu. Nasinya biasanya minta masakin orang masjid.
Biasanya berapa? Masakan nasi kan?
Hah?
Masih. Bukan.
Mas, ada kopi mas. Nasinya nggak ada. Jadi nasinya oke. Belum matang ya? Belum matang. Ini aku nih, karena apa nggak Rosi? Ide. Cuma langsung antusias. Dari apa? Dia langsung antusias sama kayak acara lah. Jadi orang Afrikanya langsung aktif itu. Dia kena dikasih dia tiap hari dia kalau yang diberi bunga gitu. Sama orang Afrika sama. Orang langsung jam ngobrol, hey, itu aja pokoknya. Aku langsung sakit. Saya ngomong, semua official, makanya kamu dikira imigrasi. Karena tapi gitu.
Tapi dianya santai.
Oh, orang Afrikanya senang banget ngechat terus. Tiap pagi dia juga SMS. Ya,
pakai pasar.
Kamu nggak jadi sarapan? Oh, alah.
Nggak tahu yang datang berapa cukup banget.
Tanya aja ya. Dari Mas.
Caranya ini orang sampai bukan.
Kamu nggak menggayat masih selalu. Bisa kan dari Mas tadi?
Makanya sebenarnya kamu sebenarnya kan tutup ya. Beberapa orang kayak Mas Mumu, Toko, maka sebenarnya harus ada yang harus dijelaskan.
Cetak tanggung, waktu.
Oh,
Kocok hal banget lagi ya. Ini kita tahu ya. Dia jelas kan dari lu ya
mana
Mas.
sekarang kok perempuan gitu. Iya, sampai jam 11. Kan ini cuma oh, ya. Cepat ya. Ya, bulan nyampe. Ini mau ronoke, aku nggak mobil kantor, jadi terus langsung ini Pak Haji Ismail, ceritanya ibu ini sih. Apa ini lebih orang? Dewa, cara si ibu ini. Jadi kamu mau kita itu bukan karena cinta, bukan. Kamu mau ya?
Iya, dan oke tunggalnya kita bisa aja oke tunggalnya.
Dia mau Afrika juga jujur di Indonesia itu pokoknya asal punya uang bukan tapi ya yang serius.
Ini kalau yang sih berarti aku harus jual di sini ya.
Yuk. Oh, ini satu aduh sebelum itu ini offline dan aku ini tentara oh ini
Nah, cekat marah bukannya yang ada itu kayak
iya orang itu kursinya 30 sampai komer
Yeah.
I have to see how I fit it in before the other things, so I can buy it. 2 weeks later. Hi, good morning.
Morning.
So we'll stop next week. I don't know, I have to call them and see if they're available, and then I will can do a few weeks in that.
Still 6 people.
3 days a week or something. Your host, yes. Good.
Sorry.
Okay. It's okay. It's okay.
On time.
Oh, yeah, okay, yes. But I was today so fast, I thought I go early because I don't know. And then I was here 20 past 8, I was like, oh. No traffic jam at all.
Yesterday's travel.
Will you start?
Just around my home. Yes, because there is a bridge and the flat. I cannot. Yes, I have to.
Yeah.
We have to go around.
to go around.
Yeah.
But
But this is, I don't know, this is the beginning of the rainy season. Will it get worse?
it's
December,
December,
yeah,
December, January.
really?
usually, yeah.
But I think it's good because
It's already
2 years
recording.
ago, I think, in October.
Yeah, it's already recording.
Another,
Because yesterday there was a problem. Record. So we try to test it.
Yeah, in October, yes. Good, I think, to start, rain. Yes, the rain is good. The infrastructure
Yeah,
could help
yeah.
deal with the rain.
Help with the flood. Because after the pandemic, if you see the infrastructure in Satellite City, there are a lot of new apartments, a lot of new compartments they built.
Yeah.
So river started to gone, river get shrink. That what makes us get flood, and he has to go around to just
Oh,
get
yeah.
home.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Like Prof. Erwisa,
Yeah.
Yeah.
actually, she already went out of her home,
Uh-huh.
but then there's still flood.
There's still.
Around.
Oh,
So-
sorry to hear that.
She has to return.
Yes. Well, good that it's hybrid at least.
How are you, Ning?
Masih
Pak
dingin.
Artanto?
Masih.
Good morning.
Sorry.
Selamat pagi. Hai.
Selamat pagi, Pak Artanto. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I cannot come and because the flood in front of my complex housing complex.
I understand. I'm sorry for you. But I'm glad that the meeting is hybrid, then at least you are here.
Yeah.
Pak Artanto
So,
used to be the ambassador
so much.
to Madagascar.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
Madagascar is not embassy, what's it called? The embassy.
The consulate?
Atasnya.
Yeah, but is in charge for Madagascar.
Oh, Madagascar.
Is to
What are you talking about? I'm not, I cannot hear it.
we tried to introduce Mr. Artanto.
Hai. Yes.
We used to in charge for Madagascar, ya, Artanto, ya.
Yeah.
Oh,
I-
yeah. Yeah.
good. Very good morning to all of
Yes,
audience. Thank you so
morning.
much.
So you also get to
Yeah, we have to deal with the flood.
Pak Artanto.
Ya, selamat pagi. Good morning, Bu
Selamat.
Erwisa Irman. Makasih for the invitation.
Ya, senang
Ya.
sekali datang Pak Artanto hadir.
Ya, sama-sama Ibu Erwin. Mohon maaf tidak bisa hadir langsung. I cannot attend for the direct to the program in Vidya Chandra, but hopefully we can take part and participation in this program. Especially, thank you so much for the host from Kewilayahan and also the speaker, Morgan. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Shall we start?
Yeah, we are still waiting for Pak Kapus to
Yeah.
give some entrance speech.
Good evening, everyone. Actually, Stephen's always. Well, I was just about to ask you because, of course, we have 4 seasons and it's also unpredictable, but the application for to predict the weather is very good. So if I look at, okay, today the rain, then I can even see it will rain from this time to this time and then it's dry. So I can say, okay, I wait 10 minutes and then I can go. So but do you have like a weather online application that works well?
Yeah, but not really always same with the.
Okay, yeah.
So we cannot
Not very.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the main difference is we have a lot of rain. Here, the rain is really very strong, concentrated, and but we have more over the whole day than usually. But there's a good water. No, it's not that the streets get flooded.
Yeah.
Not that clear.
Okay. So how long have you been in Jakarta?
I think now it's 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah.
3 weeks.
Yeah. So not so long yet.
Yeah.
But I'm enjoying.
Is it meet your expectation when you came first?
It's different, but not in a bad way. I think what I like a lot is the energy.
All right.
I'm really amazed by how friendly people are.
Okay.
I think that's really nice. And I'm shocked about how unpredictable the traffic is, even though people said all this traffic is really bad. And this is worse than I expected. So some things are really generally
Glad to hear that.
So we wait for Agus.
Or you want to start it?
So should we start it? Yes, because Pak Kapus mentioned he's still stuck. So he asked to we just to continue. He will join us.
Join later or join on?
He might be from the car if they get Wi-Fi. He will.
So can we
If
start it?
otherwise, will come.
Please.
Okay.
Cek. It's okay. Oke. Bapak Ibu, yes, okay. Okay, good morning everyone. Happy Friday. We still wait Pak Kapus to join in this room, but we can start it now. Okay, I'm Angela, a young researcher from Pusat Riset Kewilayahan or Area Studies Research Center. Welcome to our discussion, African Roots webinar series, and today we have Dr. Lidi Beckman. Sorry. Okay. Okay. She is an associate professor from the African Studies Center Leiden, Netherlands, and she will share her stories when she conduct research in Burundi, or when you going to Burundi for this research.
From
2005 until now. Okay. She will share her stories, and the title of her discussion is Intergenerational Perspective on Peace and Conflict in Burundi. Our discussion will led by Mbak Harvia Widiawati or Mbak Evi as a moderator. She is a researcher from Pusat Riset Kewilayahan, and Mbak Evi, please, your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming with us.
From this or yourself?
Okay.
Okay.
Test, test, test. Test.
So di sini ada Mbak Nisa aja. Ini aja.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining this webinar. So, today we have with us Dr. Lida Widebarkafus. She has a background in anthropology and African studies and worked as associate professor at the African Studies Center, Leiden University. In her past research, she has used anthropological perspective in multidisciplinary teams to investigate the daily lives and agency of young people and families affected by conflict in the African region, notably Burundi and Rwanda. Her new research project investigates pedagogies of peace and conflict in Rwanda to understand how past experiences may inform relapse into conflict and her foster peace. At the moment, Dr. Lida is based in the Embassy of the Netherlands in Jakarta, where she holds an NWO Embassy Science Fellowship to contribute to new South-South and trilateral knowledge project and collaborations. So, welcome, Dr. Lida. And okay, we have here with us our director for Research Center of Area Studies, Dr. Fajar Tufail. So we would like to hear some opening remark from Dr. Fajar first.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you, Lida, for your time and then for willing you for giving presentations at our center, and I really appreciate that. And I don't have many things to say. That just kind of informing that we will be very happy when you will be part of us, then maybe in the next few weeks, then we can also, as I said, and as we had a meeting before, that your visit to PRW print will be very important for us to help us develop our African Studies program. So I think that's it that I would like to say. And without further ado, please, and silakan kembali, Mbak.
Okay, thank you, Pak Kapus. And yeah, without wasting another time, we will listen to what Dr. Lida will talk about. That is about the conflict in Burundi. It will be perceived from the lens of intergenerational study and discussing the detail of how memories and knowledge of previous conflict-inspired practices and strategies of protest, protection, and revenge. Hopefully, we will have a fruitful discussion later. So I will give the floor and time to Dr. Lida.
Hear me well? Do turn it on?
Kayaknya ditaruh aja.
Kenapa itu? Kenapa? Mic-nya kenapa?
Ya, ini nggak bisa.
Yang itu,
Yang mana?
yang ini ya.
Ya, bisa aja. Cuma tadi jangan suara.
Dimatiin semua ininya.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, you can all hear me. Otherwise, please wave. So,
Apakah suaranya bagus, Bapak Ibu sekalian?
Yes, we can hear you.
Bagus,
clearly.
bagus, bagus.
Yeah, very good.
yes, great. Well, thank you very much. First, that you have welcomed me and that I have the honor to kick off the webinar series on African roots. I am curious already about all the others that will follow. So my presentation is entitled Intergenerational Perspectives on Peace and Conflict in Burundi. And maybe I can ask you to go to the next slide to help me in this presentation. Or I can do it myself if I can reach all the way there. Yes, thank you. So I prepared a bit of a presentation that will start slow first with a bit of my own background so that you have a good idea of who is in front of you telling the story. Then, because I'm not sure that everyone is well aware of Burundi and its history, its recent history. So I will talk a little bit about Burundi, first from a bird's eye view, and then also share some of the memories of war and life in its aftermath from people who were living there. And then I will go to talk about the mass demonstrations and the crisis in 2015, which is really a moment when I saw that experiences of the past and legacies of the past gave new meaning and were utilized again in the shaping of a new political crisis. I will end with some reflections on my current research, which has only recently started, and which looks at the pedagogies of peace and conflict, and on some ideas that I have for future research, which would be more on this side of looking at the pedagogies of healing and peace, and perhaps comparing. For this, I will need your help and conversation with you, comparing some of the experiences in Indonesia with what I've seen and have been studying in the Great Lakes region. So I'm very curious to hear also your thoughts on that. Maybe we can go to the next slide.
It's your background.
So here you see me 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago. I started doing research in the Great Lakes region, and particularly with Burundians from 2005. I first went there as master students to do research in a refugee camp in Tanzania. And the refugee camp turned out to host primarily Burundian refugees. And my research was with young people to try to understand how their life, how they identified themselves living and growing up in refugee camps while their country was in turmoil. And the future wasn't clear about whether or not they could return or not, or had to stay in the camp, or were able to integrate in Tanzanian society. But my research at that time in 2005 took place when in Burundi a lot of changes were occurring. So after internationally brokered peace agreements, a new president had come into power. Or you can still, well, it's okay.
Just wait.
Yeah, it's okay. So in this time, I saw that many of the young people that I was doing research with, they were wondering about whether they could return or not to their home country. So in my subsequent research, I wanted to go do research with young people in Burundi to try and understand how they, as a new generation, could contribute to fostering peace. I was always interested in this kind of resilience and among people, and then I went looking for it, you can say, in the most difficult places like life in refuge or in conflict-affected countries. So this is when in 2007, and then later for my PhD in 2009 until 2011, I also went to Burundi to do research in total for about 14 months, and with young people mainly who were living in the capital. But as time was progressing, I also realized that even though my interest was in trying to understand the contribution of young people to fostering peace in the aftermath of war, the story was much more complex. And there were many signs that maybe it was not a period before peace would be more consolidated, but it could also be a period in which a relapse into conflict was being taking shape. So in my subsequent research, which was together with the university, with a team of the University of Amsterdam and with UNICEF and with a local NGO called Fondation TPO and the University of Burundi, we conducted a research which looked at the intergenerational transmission of violence and resilience. And we focused mostly on families and on children in schools and trying to understand how experiences of conflict and trauma were being transmitted to the next generation and how this could also affect the well-being and the behavior of children in the school and family settings. But as we were doing this research, a political crisis started again in 2015. So the project had not yet finished, and we had to stop the field work towards the end of our research already. And we saw that new violence had already arrived. And this was a period when, again, more than 400,000 people fled the country, when several thousand deaths, several thousand people died. We don't know the exact number, and many people disappeared, and we are far from knowing what number of people disappeared. So from this period, my research, you can still, yeah. Does it move? It's fine, something. So from this period in 2016 until 2020, I conducted some short stints of research, sometimes in Rwanda with people who had fled from Burundi, mainly people that I had already known from my earlier research, people who had been young at the time I started my research and who with me were growing up into adults and parents. Also sometimes going back to Burundi, where I saw other people who sometimes used to be friends and connected with, but now on other sides of the social divide. So all this research inspired me to take a different perspective and try to understand these cycles of violence and build on the research that I did with families to try and understand how conflict is in a way being taught to new generations. This is where my interest comes from. And I've been trained as an anthropologist, but I've been working a lot in interdisciplinary settings. So this also means that for my research, I often worked in interdisciplinary teams, primarily with people who have a background in psychology or psychiatry and who are more versed perhaps also in the more medical approaches to trauma. But from this research, I also learned that from an anthropological perspective, we have actually a lot to contribute in terms of trying to understand how, like culture, trauma can be transmitted, and experiences, traumatic events, can feed into new ways of looking into the world, new ways of being with other people, new ideas on who you are, how you should raise your children, on what ways you should prepare them for a prosperous future. So this is where I wanted to take a much more anthropological approach and focus on these pedagogies. But then let me go first to Burundi. Maybe the next slide. Yes. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with Burundi. Burundi is a very small country. It is smaller than the Netherlands. I don't dare to compare it to Indonesia, which is one of the biggest countries in the world. Maybe it's like Bali, I don't know. It's really very small. Do you know maybe how small the Netherlands is compared to Indonesia? Jakarta, yeah. Perhaps.
To Jakarta.
To Jakarta, in terms of population in any case, yes. So it's a very small country, really in the heart of Africa. And when it was colonized in the early 1900s, it was first colonized by the Germans and then by the Belgians. And they gained their independence in 1962. During the period of colonization, the colonizing powers, they kind of made the ethnic stratification that was there and was much more rigid and gave as only the Tutsi population possibilities to prepare themselves for education and thus also become part of the status apparatus. And within this group of Tutsi, unlike in Rwanda, there were also other groups. So there was also within the different clans that were belonging to this ethnic group, there were some tensions and clashes. So in 1962, when they became independent, they were still a kingdom and they had more or less the same boundaries as before the colonizing powers arrived, which means that this is also not a context where the borders have been artificially drawn. The context in that sense is quite different in this country than in some of the other African countries. And there was a lot of trouble already around this period because of these very stark different chances and possibilities for developing yourself and becoming part of the elites in power. So in this period in 1966, there was a coup. There were actually 3 coups, and finally it succeeded in the sense that the colonel, Michumbero, who was from the south, who was a Tutsi, Rima, so from a particular clan of Tutsi, he came into power. And from then on, there was a military rule with one power only for many decades. And each time, each 10 years roughly, a new president came into power, each time with a coup. So it was quite a violent turnover in these periods, and it's also saw quite some violence. If you look at the country at large, it was been struggling with poverty for a long time. It's largely rural. In one of the on the table below, you see that the urbanization rate is quite low. In the 1960s, it was only 2%, and now it is only 14%. So it is still quite a small group of people who live in urbanized contexts. And similarly, it is also most people live off subsistence farming. Is the sound good still for everyone? I can't see anyone except here, but thank you. So it is one of the poorest countries in the world. Yes,
I think that's my profile is for this school. But for online, you have to unmute account of satu.
Ya, ini udah di.
Udah tak.
Udah. Terus.
Unmute lagi.
Yes? Yes. Okay. So it's okay. So more generally speaking, it's a very rural country. Most people live off subsistence farming. It has been poor for a very long time, and these various episodes of crisis made poverty and transit itself getting more difficult. Sometimes there are also international sanctions that also affected the national sanctions that followed crisis or coup d'etats. And it has a very young population. So with currently a median age of 17.3 years old, quite young. And it has a very turbulent political history. Like I mentioned already, in the 1962, it gained independence, but already in these early years, there were a lot of political intrigues and violence took place, which started to more and more be framed around ethnic lines. And in 1972, this culminated in what here is called the Ikiza killings, but it refers to what they euphemistically call the events when several 100,000 Hutu, mainly Hutu intellectuals, and that could even be secondary school boys and girls, were killed in an attempt to make sure that they would not gain positions in power. This was followed by the Second Republic, the coup d'etat in the Second Republic, and there was no mass violence, but there was there were other ways in which the population was struggling to build their lives and livelihoods. In 1987, there was a new coup d'etat, and this was the period just before an opening of the democratic space, but it also entailed a new period of mass violence, which finally in 1993, when the new president had been elected, the Hutu president, in contrast to the minority Tutsi who had been in power until then, 100 days after his being in power, he was attacked and killed by the army in a coup. This was the start of a civil war that continued for more than a decade. Oh yes.
Still taking time.
Right.
Bagi stop share.
Ya, stop share nanti bisa share lagi.
Nggak mau. Stop share lagi ya.
Ada yang belum tahu?
Ini PowerPoint-nya dipindah dulu. Pindah switch. Ya, itu PowerPoint buka.
Oke,
Ini.
ada persoalan teknis.
Terus.
Oke, mohon ditunggu sebentar.
Kelihatan nggak di sini?
Ini udah kelihatan Mas ya. Okay, thank you. Yes, this is okay. So just to briefly recapitulate, sorry for the technical issues, but this is just a quick overview of all the different changes in the past 50, 60 years. And it shows basically a lot of changes in terms of military takeover of through coups, and some of the most significant events of violence that took place in the past. But maybe if we go to the next slide, because this is also difficult to capture in a very short image, you get a sense of what it is like for people who were living through these periods and looking back. So from a government senator who was reflecting on the past, he said, after the arrival of the Belgians, this was calm. So this was a period in which the Belgian colonial powers enforced people not to fight anymore over territory because they wanted to be the only ones. So when it was calm, the La Paix des Belges, the peace of the Belgians, it is relatively speaking, of course. So after the arrival of the Belgians, it was calm. Since Rwanda in 1959, when there the first troubles began, and Burundi in 61, 65, and then 72, 93, in the years of independence, let's say since the 1960s. In those days, there were cyclical wars, regular wars, crisis wars, some worse than others, but every other 5 years, there was something. There was a small crisis or a big crisis. And now since 93 until now, there's crisis, you see. How many years is that? Almost 20, since 91. And then 91, there was something. In 88, there was something. After 72, between 72 and 88, there were 15 or 16 years of peace because there had been a big confrontation, a big shock. And after a big shock, there's calmness. So in this quote, you see that the different years, they tumble over each other. And what it mainly showed to me is that besides all these different episodes that I remembered as periods of violence, in the experience of a lot of people, these were cyclical violence and sometimes unending experiences of violence. So there was among the population always, in the time that I was there, even post-war, always a sense, well, we don't know for how long it will stay calm, but we should be prepared that things may turn around, that the situation can be different again. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So what happened in my research just prior to 2015, when indeed the crisis started again, is that I was working at the time with a colleague, with different colleagues, research assistants, on research within families. But because of the new crisis, I was in Burundi, stuck in my compound. I couldn't go anywhere else around in the city. Here it is the flooding that blocks you, but there it was the violence and the roadblocks that meant that you couldn't really move out anymore. And also my research assistants, people that I was working with, they were stuck in their houses and sometimes in the neighborhoods where most of the violence took place. So being stuck at home and not being able to see and witness what was going on there, I spoke to one of my research assistants and we decided to try and capture what was happening by keeping a diary. And I asked him to keep a diary of the daily events that were taking place. And then later we worked this into a paper where he used his memories, also in his reflections, to try and understand the events that he saw in 2005 occurring when the new crisis was starting. So he was reflecting on his neighborhood in the past and also on the legacy of what was happening in this neighborhood here. And he says, in 1991, the first attack of Burundi's rebel movement, Hutu FNL, so this was a pro-Hutu rebel movement, took place in Cibitoke. We left the country, but had a plot and house in Cibitoke. And my father said, now they are knocking on my door. And he hurried to have an iron gate and fence built around the plot for protection. So his family explained that this way we can hear them knocking while they are still far, referring to the enemy. If there is no gate, then then there's no possibility to run. But if there is a gate, there's a little bit of distance, and perhaps the possibility that you can escape. In later years, the story was often recounted by my mother to warn us to keep distance from danger, to not go looking for danger. And my father, who was a military until the 1980s, so before the war, before the crisis, he gave us more advice, and especially to my older brothers, as they were adolescents during the Civil War. And then he goes on to explain some of the ways in which some of the advices that he was giving. Like, for instance, please, when you see a military coming and you see that you can still run and get away. But if it is a police officer, they are allowed to shoot. Their duty says that they can shoot someone in the back, so stay still. So they were very practical, sometimes advice about how you should behave in situations of acute danger. So he's reflecting on his past war. And maybe we can go to the next slide. And in this neighborhood where you was growing up, Cibitoke, with this neighborhood in the northern part of the capital, or the former capital, I have to say, you also reflect that ethnic segregation became very strict. So Hutus could live in Kamenge, and Tutsi had to move to Cibitoke. And anyone who dared to set foot on the other neighborhoods would be likely killed. But also during this process of segregation, a lot of violence took place and people lost their lives. And he says ethnic segregation became so strict that I remember thinking, I know that one day peace will come again, but I cannot imagine a Tutsi going to Kamenge neighborhood or a Hutu coming to Cibitoke again. And in some of these periods, young and adult men were trained to handle guns because the soldiers who were supposed to protect this neighborhood, they would fire out different places in the country for the war. And so these young men and adults in the neighborhoods, they were trained as paramilitary, trained for self-defense. And in the evening, they used to gather at 5 or 6 for night rounds. He's also saying my family protected me from seeing violence, yet notwithstanding all their efforts, growing up in this neighborhood meant growing up surrounded with stories about deaths and killings. We heard many stories about heroic soldiers, but also about other young people in youth militia who were bragging about the violence, and they were glorified. That kind of violence was seen as protecting the community and being important. But then life in the aftermath came, so we can go to the next slide. And interestingly, also to his own surprise, ethnic segregation eased, and people were visiting these other neighborhoods again. You could move around quite freely, and even though people were also always still guarding where you were from, and so which ethnic background you had, there was a lot of openness, especially in these neighborhoods, I would say, that allowed young people to discuss what had happened in the past. And there were even intermarriage taking place. And here you see 2 girls, for instance, 2 friends who are of different ethnic backgrounds and who hung out a lot and who would openly discuss about the past and the sides that they inherited on. In this period after the post-war, there was also a lot of opening of democratic space. It was an internationally brokered peace agreement with South Africa and Tanzania having intervened, but also the international community from the West being very interested in supporting, and also the Netherlands, for instance, who thought, well, this is a small country, maybe we can make a difference here. So you saw there were a lot of initiatives to also work with young people, because young people had been also one of the ones who were in the front lines of these youth militia groups of violence or in rebel movements, for instance. So young people, on the one hand, they represented in this period also hope and fear, but at the same time fear, because they would also be deciding for the other way around. They had become in this period an important constituency because of the vote. And there were so many young people, so the median age is 17 years old. They're allowed to vote officially from 18 years old. So these young people, they constituted a large group of people that on the one hand were voters, but on the other hand also showed this possibility for military power, military force, which had for a long time been used in politics to intimidate and to make sure that you came to power. At the same time, young people were still struggling, especially in this aftermath, but with finding their life. So they were searching. Chercher la vie is an expression that they often use, searching for their life and livelihoods. So if we go back now, we see that in this period after 2005, Nkurunziza came to power as elected president. This was when the powers he goes was he was elected into presidency, the first post-war president, you could say, and he was in power until 2010. And from 2010 he was re-elected, but there were a lot of troubles around these 2010 elections. And there were the opposition parties that had been fraud and they had pulled back. And so there was a lot of tensions around this. But from this, because of all the opposition parties pulling back, it allowed the party to which he belongs in the DFDG to get a stronger grip on society, something which he wanted to continue. So when the new elections came in 2015, he announced that he would be again president of the elections. But this was in violation with the constitution, which did spoke of 2 terms, and the Arusha Peace Agreement, which spoke of 2 terms for the president. So there was a lot of controversy around this. And because of all the, because on the one hand of the having experienced the openness of democratic space, but also struggling with life and wanting for change, because the political elite at the time, the CND that had been in power for 15 years, had not been delivering, had not been helping them in finding their jobs or finding career possibilities. There was a lot of unrest among young people, and a mass demonstration started. We can go to the next slide. And this was just before the elections were taking place. The elections were announced to take place in May of 2015, and in April you saw that this announcement was made that Nkurunziza would again win the presidency, and this was also the next day following that announcement. The young people took to the street. We can go to the next slide. And the young people that went to the street went there with an idea. They said, well, we thought things were going to change, like in Rwanda. They went through hardship, but it ended, and now they are focused on development. But as you can see, it was not what was expected that happened. All the issues started related to this 3rd term. So young people started these mass demonstrations. They were called on by civil society leaders who said to the leaders in power, well, if Nkurunziza announces himself to be again the presidential candidate, we will tell everyone to go to the street. We will organize peaceful demonstrations. So young people, they listened to this, and they actually took the initiative, but many more young people than was anticipated. So it was really widespread. We can go to the next slide. And on the first day already, there was lethal violence. It was not even had not even started for several hours when the first people were killed. And it was not that people had not been expecting violence, because in 2005, in 2010, in 1993, they had seen that around electoral periods there was violence. So there was the sense of that maybe war is coming. And there had been tensions before. And there were also other signs that tensions were to be expected in this period. Around the New Year's, a rebel group was caught traversing the border from DR Congo into Burundi. And they somehow ended up in a confusing situation where most of the young rebels, about 100 young people, were killed. There were also some other politically motivated killing that took place in the months prior to the mass demonstrations. And as a way of organizing youth groups and young men, there were peace marches, but they felt more like demonstrations of power, military power in the streets. So they were marching for street, but they were singing songs that people had been hearing during the Civil War. So they were sports groups, but they were not really experienced as sports groups. They were more seen as displays of their power, of youth power. And when political parties, new parties opened their offices, there was violence. And there were also rumors already that, of course, this president wanted to remain in power, in the office. So the call for mass demonstrations was a way to say, okay, we are disagreeing with all this. We want change, and at least a different presidential candidate to keep the power balance more or less equated. But as I mentioned, we can go to the next slide. The start of the demonstrations was immediately violent. One of the demonstrators explains how it went from their side, and he was a young man. And he says, at the start, we tried to raise awareness among everybody to start demonstrating, but nobody wanted to hear us. Seeing that they were refusing, we started with a number of 16 people. We went into the streets and blocked it with rope, with tires and stones. And everybody in the neighborhood went outside to see us. They looked at us as if we had become crazy. We faced policemen who were armed up to their teeth, and seeing them, you could easily understand that they had come with the permission and intention to kill. They shot at us. We spread, fleeing into neighborhoods, and then returned an instant later, and gradually repeating the pattern we became more numerous. So even though these demonstrations had maybe for the young people started with the idea we start peaceful demonstrations, the confrontation with police made it immediately into a violent confrontation. And this young man with whom I was working reflected on what he experienced. He said, well, it was about 10:30 a.m. on a Sunday. From a distance, I heard a lot of gunfire coming from Mutakura. I saw people running, fleeing from Mutakura and Cibitoke to Ngagara neighborhood, where my church was based. But together with another church member, we wondered what was going on. We were used to hearing gunshots whenever police faced armed bandits. But on this day, the shooting was especially heavily. And people were running past us saying, don't go there, it's hot, it has started. So things turned immediately into a more violent situation, more violent than people had expected. And it's made us wonder, me and the co-author, how some of the, how it took so little time actually to really change the rules of the game from the way in which people interacted and from how things were organized in the city. It was, if you go to the next slide, the demonstrators, they seem to have experience with how to organize the demonstrations. They had roadblocks in the first instance. They knew that they needed to block the cars, specifically the cars that were the secret service, and they knew how to do that. People had, families had whistles to, in the evening, in the night, to warn if something was happening in their house or around their house, to warn the others to know to be careful. Parents told their children, and this was just within a day, to sleep with clothes on. So because they had experience that in the past you may have to flee in the middle of the night. And knife rounds were organized on the 27th. So the demonstration started on the 26th of April, and on the 22nd, there were already knife rounds in all these neighborhoods where the mass demonstrations took place. But also the stories that were glorifying military lifestyle and values, including values of revenge and what it meant to be a real man, they were shared again, and they were remembered, and they were glorified. And these experience of new violence and confrontations, they triggered memories of fear and wondered, and people wondered, even though that the demonstrations were never announced as ethnic demonstrations, around ethnicity. It were much more about this ruling party and trying to change the elite, which were multi-ethnic, officially multi-ethnic parties, although stemming from a rebel background. People were wondering, is it salient again? One of the young men we were talking to I was actually at this moment participated. When the demonstration started, he decided to help train young people in using weapons. And the first days he was okay with training everybody who was on their side. After a couple of days, he said, well, no, I won't train Hutu anymore because tomorrow maybe the violence will be taking place around ethnic lines. The presence of weapons were there, but also sometimes there were no weapons and suddenly they came from somewhere. So these connections were still there. And what I mentioned with the example, a lot of military skills, weapons and fighting were easily activated. Some of the explanations we're trying to understand these mass demonstrations, which were largely carried out by young people, are focusing on these young people as being a new generation. And they were growing up, especially in this period, they had never seen this military rule, which was very repressive, but had grown up in a period of either wartime, where there were still young children, or post-war, when these democratic spaces opened. And they had also seen some examples where protest worked, like small-scale protests or strikes at the university or elsewhere, and with all the stories about peaceful demonstrations. And there was also this aspiration that maybe this would be a way to make changes and to have their voices heard. But focusing on them as a new generation is also a bit risky, because if you think of the stories that I shared or the quotes, it was also a lot about the connection of this generation to earlier generations, to older brothers or to friends who had different experience, and to peers who had maybe been trained as child soldiers. So these boundaries of neighborhoods are very blurry in that sense. And it's actually one of our findings is that actually the fact that civilians or who are civilians and soldiers who had a past as either military or paramilitary or as child soldiers, for instance, they were living close together. So these boundaries between who is a civilian and who is a soldier, they were very blurred, because in that neighborhood and the other neighborhoods like it, people had received some kind of military training just because of the experience of growing up in a neighborhood that was strongly affected by the Civil War. So this whole idea of historical generations then as one generation post-war or pre-war, it becomes a bit fuzzy because people are differently situated and very strongly connected. And I think this for us was something that was triggering a lot of questions, because when we look at the literature, which is more from a medical perspective, looking at the intergenerational transmission, a lot is about this transmission of trauma from one generation to a new generation that had not experienced the trauma or the traumatic events. But in this context, there was actually so much connection and overlap that made it possible to very quickly share the strategies, to very quickly have everyone understand that young people 15 years and older, they should participate in these house rounds without much resistance. Without everybody understanding, okay, so children, they have to put on the clothes when they go sleep at night, sometimes sleep under the bed rather than on the bed. So all these kind of small strategies to keep yourself safe or to vent yourself and your people, they were so readily present and available and easily shared with people around. In my current research, I'm looking more into further deepening this understanding by looking at informal pedagogies of peace. So I'm calling it informal pedagogies because I'm not looking into schools and informal pedagogies that are maybe developed through ideas on peace education or policies on peace education, but more on what happens in families, on people who have experienced the conflict and how they use this to think about how they want to raise their children, more or less conscious. And in my current research project, together with the University of Rwanda, we are asking ourselves, so what are the implicit, explicit, verbal, embodied, and material teachings derived from experience of war? And how are they shared, learned, and contested within families? And it's inspired by this idea of intergenerational transmission, but taken from a very broad perspective. So as Dixon Gomez, an anthropologist who was working in El Salvador, says, it is also the process by which a traumatized worldview of fear, of pessimism, of violence is socialized into the next generation. And it can have profound effects in society. So I'm interested in a way in how experience of conflict also through families, through new generations actually change societies. How that is a motor for new ways of looking into the world and relating and shaping societies. And like in the research that I mentioned before, like the research, the 2015 crisis, we have a lot of examples from this. So from Burundi, for instance, just prior to the crisis, a young mother told me that she really wanted to try and make her child independent from a very early age. And she said it in this way: you don't want a child to know how to make an omelet or tea by the force of war. When parents are no longer there, they have to be able to take care of themselves. She was reflecting on her own childhood, where she had to learn a lot by herself because her parents were not available. Or to sum up, those of us older, like reflecting on the research that I just explained, those of us older than 10 in 2015 grew up in close contact with military life, learning and admiring the lifestyle, adopting a military vocabulary, and for some having knowledge about military tactics and techniques. But even more recently, someone who who had been in Burundi, not at the time of the crisis because he was working beyond, but when he came back to Burundi, he was arrested and tortured and found a way to flee, then joined the rebel movement and tried to escape the rebel movement. And when I asked him, okay, so I asked him something about parenting, and he said, when I have children, I will teach them two things. One, to avoid politics. Two, to avoid the army, everything that he hadn't done and his family had not done. But also these ideas of, okay, so what does all these experiences mean? So I want to, in my future research, if we go to the next, I want to have more hopeful stories to share and something that people can use to build on. So I want to explore intergenerational healing and peace. So from some of the research that I did with refugees from Burundi and Belgium, in the Netherlands, for instance, I noticed that a lot of parents wanted to overcome these ethnic difference, and they said, and ethnic, but also national differences, being a refugee in Belgium or in the Netherlands. And they said, I want my child to grow up as a global person. So marry or relate with anyone they want. They want me to be known as a global citizen. They're not from the Netherlands. They're not from Belgium. Not from Burundi. They're not Hutu. Others were saying, well, I will not tell the history of my country because I want to avoid anger or hatred. And others said, well, I need to tell my children so they do not repeat the same mistake. But also more recent research that is being developed in Rwanda by a young scholar who's called Otaka. And she's looking into intergenerational gift giving as a way of healing. So parents who maybe give a gift to someone and the children want to repay it by taking care of the other children. So as a way of mending the social fabric over the long term. There's a lot of in anthropological literature about gift giving, and she wants to see it as a way, or explore it as a way of healing a society where new ties are being made possible over the generations. But these are new questions, I think, and so far I haven't seen a lot happening in the field. So I'm curious to try and see if we can have this conversation further. And then how do societies or communities or families learn from crisis? How are these messages passed on to novices, new generations? But also, for instance, here, how are experiences of past crises in various parts in Indonesia present in contemporary orientations and practices in Indonesian society, communities, or families? And in which ways do conflict-affected communities or families seek to foster intergenerational healing and peace here? What patterns can we discern from how different societies, communities, and families in the African Great Lakes region and Indonesia seek to foster intergenerational healing and peace in the aftermath of crisis? And how can we learn from this, build on and expand on the experience and practices that foster intergenerational healing and peace in these two different parts of the world? So I hope that from learning and the focus of these cyclical violence, these experiences of repeated experience of violence in the Great Lakes region, we can actually turn it around and learn about crisis for the future. So not about the past repeating itself, but the past for changing the future. And I think this would be, for me, a really interesting avenue for future research. So we can go to the next and almost last slide. I hope I wrote it well. Terima kasih. Final
what?
Thank you, Uli. Murakosi-chan. So, thank you for your attention. I spoke long, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Wide, for the presentation. And it was a very interesting topic. And I think we can all find there are a little bit similarities because here in Indonesia, we also have some violence and, some tactics using memories or imposing creation or something like that. I think that would be very interesting. So if anyone of you have wants to say something, comments or questions, please you can raise your hand or or you can write it in chat column.
No question.
Okay, there are already two person here who wants to questions. Okay, first Pak Mas Hakam, silakan.
As far as I know, Tutsi people, Tutsi ethnic, sub-ethnic Hutu, they're more educated and in the past the ruler of the Rwanda and Burundi. Burundi and Rwanda is
There are two countries, but during the period of colonization, they were put into one protectorate, Rwanda Urundi, yes.
And Tutsi people is more educated and ruling class, as far as I know, rather than the Hutu. And what the perception Hutu and Tutsi now, it's the same position or still have
So with all these alternations of power, it's also quite interesting that in Rwanda it was different than from Burundi. So during the colonial period, it was indeed very much emphasized that the Tutsi were the ruling class. They gained the possibility to learning.
And they in army position, high army.
Yes, exactly. So they were in basically the colonial powers tried to rule through them, through Tutsi, by giving advantages to Tutsi. But then in 1959, when the struggle for independence started in Rwanda, the colonial power started to back the Hutu. So at independence in Rwanda, the Hutu came into power. And in many years following, there were a lot of attacks and violence against Tutsi, including, of course, the infamous genocide in 1994. But in Burundi, the Tutsi minority, who had been given all the possibilities to be the indirect rulers during the colonial period, they remained in power at the transition when they became independent. And it was a very small clique of Tutsi Hima who were actually the leaders and more. So there were a lot of advantages for those coming from the north and the Tutsi Hima rather than the Tutsi Baganda, for instance. So there were some advantages in that side. Now, after democratic space was opened, because also in numbers, the Tutsi were a minority, both in Rwanda and Burundi. After democratization period in the 1990s, in 1993, there were elections, and about the number that is estimated of Hutu that are there were voting pro a Hutu president. He came into power in 1993, but was assassinated by Tutsi in the military in 100 days later. And this was very much condemned by the international community. So you had for a short period, the coup was not successful, and you had for a short period a Hutu president that was succeeding him. But in 1994, this president was in the plane with the president from Rwanda when the plane got shot down, when the genocide in Rwanda started. So that also was the moment when Burundi again had no president. So there was a lot of trouble in that time. And the assassination of the Hutu president, the first Hutu president, is actually seen as the start of the civil war, because from then on, 12 years long, there were a lot of fighting, and mainly the Tutsi military fighting Hutus who started to develop more strongly rebel movements. But since 2005, we have in Burundi a president who's of Hutu background, but officially the political parties have to share power. So there is ethnic power sharing within the constitution of 60% Hutu, 40% Tutsi. Yeah. So it's a complex story about the ethnic differences, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, selanjutnya next, Pak Lala.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting for me, your perspective. Are some young people in Burundi have an opportunity to going out from the country to maybe another country to have education or something, maybe in the period of access to education?
Well, actually, I think they're
to be a global person.
To be a global person. So this example that I gave was more from the Burundian refugees who fled to, for instance, Europe or to US or Canada, where I heard parents speak about this ambition that they wanted to raise their children as global citizens. But in Burundi, the possibilities for education, for higher education especially, are quite limited. So you see, especially from the more middle class and elite, that they try to send their children to study elsewhere. And if they do not have a lot of money, but still have these ambitions, they can send them to Uganda or to India. There's also quite a few connections with China. So there are a lot of students who are going these days to China. Some are going to Rwanda, but because of the tensions politically between Rwanda and Burundi, this is not an easy country, because if you come back as a young person from Rwanda, then you are suspected that maybe you are a spy, or so Rwanda is not favorite destination in that sense. But you see that mainly for the quality of education, parents do want to send their children abroad. And even France, to have really good education that is recognized worldwide. But more easy are possibilities in Asia or in Uganda and Kenya, for instance.
And they, when they come back to Burundi, they have they give feedback or more perspective to their country, or?
That is a good question. I'm not sure how well it works actually, in the sense of, but you do see that it opens up a lot of possibilities for them to develop themselves and to have a more open outlook. But what I wanted to, what I fear, what is happening is that also at the start of these mass demonstrations, young people said, no, we are all working together, no matter what neighborhood, no matter which ethnic background, because we want change. We want possibilities for employment, for education, for health, for life chances in general. And they were quite united irrespective of their ethnic background. But when violence continues, then there is both manipulation by the political elites to show, well, it's actually the Tutsi want to go back into power, as well as a fear through memories that maybe the rules of the game will change. And maybe I can think now that my Hutu friend is my Hutu, but tomorrow, because of the political changes, we are enemies and he can attack me. So there is this fear that the rules can change. So even though in the spirit of in many fears they can have very open spirit, but the fear is there that things can change, and then that continues to be a threat to also this idea of global citizenship, I think.
Yeah. It's about trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So young people still feel the structure rather than the
Yeah.
reality.
Well, they have experienced it. That's not just believing, they have experienced it, because of course you don't only identify yourself, but you are identified by others. So, and you see that the region in this sense also plays a role. If you go to Rwanda, it is now Kagame who is in power, who is a Tutsi. So what you saw that during the crisis, a lot of Tutsi felt safe to flee to Rwanda rather than to Tanzania, where a lot of Hutu went, because they say, well, there's a Tutsi presence, he might better protect us than if we go to somewhere else. So you see that in this region, these ethnic differences, they remain salient. So it's not so easy to escape, even if you want to be open, it's not so easy to escape from those structures. Yeah.
Is there any habit or culture between in a Hutus or Tutsi for the mother telling a story outside the conflict? For example, bedtime stories about historical places or other kind of cultural stories.
I think this is a really important and fascinating question, and I'm curious about it because of all. I've only been here for a very short time in Indonesia, but I see that there's so much cultural richness here, and I wonder how much has been able to remain also in Burundi through the period of colonization, through all the violence after, because some of the ways in which people in the past sat together and recounted stories about kings, about myths, or those kind of stories, some of those are no longer there because people fell away. The grandfather who used to sit with it. So you see that a lot of this knowledge about the past and these stories and this cultural richness, a lot seems to have disappeared, both through poverty, but also through violence and also through colonization. So I'm wondering how much alternative, because that's what you are pointing at, how much alternative stories and messages and pedagogies can be passed on. And I think that would be an interesting dimension of comparison, because of all the richness of all those. You can live outside politics here, I have the sense. You can decide as a young person, maybe a lot of this decided by politics, but you can find a way to carve your life without necessarily being involved in some way or another with the political elite. And in Burundi, it's difficult because you need to have like a political stalwart to be able to go to the university, to be able to go. You need a patron very often, and in periods of political elections, everybody wants to know on which side are you. You will have the repercussion if the wrong one loses. So it's much more difficult to not be involved in politics. Yeah. Especially for young men. For young women, it's more easy. They can say, no, politics is to the domain of men, so they have some freedom there. And you see sometimes for adults who are family, like fathers, they can say, well, I just have to make a living, so I don't have time for politics. For young men, for youth, they seem to be very much pressured into being involved in some way and aligning themselves with political parties or patrons or.
Parents tell differently to their daughter and son.
In terms of advice, yes, like the example that I gave you of the father, he was giving the military advice mostly to the sons, right? They are adolescent sons, so he was giving those kind of advices more to the boys than necessarily to the girls. So you see that, yes, and you also see that boys, they are raised with the expectation. They are also called from a long time as the warriors, the protectors of the families. And that was always in the cultural perception of the boys. They are the ones who are, when you have a son, they say, oh, congratulations with your warrior. When you have a house with 3 warriors, 3 sons, you are well protected. So those kind of things are still there. Whereas for women, they are educated less as expecting them to become part of it. And you see that they find boys more difficult to raise, and they are more often, these are also more stricter, but at the same time, they're also let free to go outside. And so there are different ways of teaching and practicing, but not necessarily in stories, but more preparing their future role in society as men or women, I think.
Oke. Silakan, apa masih ada lagi barangkali yang mau bertanya atau memberi komentar?
Good morning, selamat pagi.
Pak Artanto. Silakan Pak.
Silakan Pak.
Terima kasih. Thank you so much for Dr. Leader Weiss for your presentation. It is very important for us to know more about the root of African history and also the current issues especially in Indonesia. Okay, then first of all, I would like to thank and appreciation to BRIN Wilayahan for organizing of this very important webinar meeting. Why? Because in Indonesia, especially, we have less information. The latest was called history, was called root African in terms of the African studies. So we are very glad to hear from the presentation of Dr. Lidwit. We do hope that in the next program, so we can continue this program, Ibu Pak Irwisa dan Ibu Irwisa, and also the Kepala Pusat Wilayah BRIN. So this is, I noted here, this is the first series about the webinar focusing on Africa. Maybe later on we will continuing the second series on African issues of this very important program is in terms of studies and study kajian about Africa. And the second thing, Thank you so much for the Dr. Lei for your presentation. Here, after listening your presentation, that especially relating to the what's called 75, also called I think this is the time you're mentioning about the around the 75 about the Tutsi, what's called Hutu and other things. But I will ask maybe your question. I ask question about what's the relating the previous what's it called conflict in between the Tutsi Hutu and the in to the nowadays current issues, especially now in the let's say after a pandemic, maybe is there any is a relation with the impact of the conflict between the previous conflict in the what's it called the recent situation, especially in Rwanda, because here I just read one article about just sorry, this in Rwanda also there was still have policy especially to the journalists and here I just read one article about the release of 3 journalists in Rwanda recently and this is my question. Maybe you can give what's called the latest information. What's the connection? The previous what's called conflict in Rwanda with the recent situation. And here also I mentioned also is Ibu Erwita and also ladies and gentlemen here in our webinar also I also ask our friend from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also here present here. I think Mr. Ilham Sucabrata also maybe others also representing from the Directorate of African Affairs. So with this webinar, I do hope that they will continue the series webinar. So like say BRIN and also other Asian African studies will organizing this webinar, and also we also invite from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also what experts like Dr. White. So again, thank you so much for this webinar. We do hope that we can meet again. Thank you so much.
So if I recapitulate the question well, you are interested in trying to hear more about the current situation, especially in Rwanda, in relation to tensions and conflict that may be there along ethnic lines. What I think I want to approach it a little bit broader by looking more broader at the Great Lakes region. In Burundi, what you saw since the civil war is that actually most of the tensions occur between different Hutu groups, different political parties that have a history as Hutu rebel movements, because they represent the largest constituencies in a way, and Tutsi are much more sidelined. This is indeed quite different in Rwanda. But in Rwanda, the official rhetoric, of course, is that there are no longer Hutu and Tutsi. You're not allowed to mention these words even in society. It is seen as a way of hate talk, and you can be arrested for this. Instead, there are only Banyarwanda, people from Rwanda. Now, of course, in reality, the things are different insofar that even though maybe words of Hutu and Tutsi are not used, there are very much divisions in society because of this extremely devastating traumatic past, where you have had people now that they refer to as those who were hunted during the genocide against the Tutsi, and those who were not hunted during the genocide against the Tutsi, which is in a way still differentiating between different categories of Banyarwanda along these what was formerly seen as ethnic lines. Now, in the region, you see that this ethnic relations do play a role, because also there are also Banyarwanda, Banyamulenga, who are formerly who are seen as the Congolese Tutsi. They are also in Congo, and there are also Banyarwanda in Uganda. So you see that in this region there are a lot of connections also to other places where ethnicity does play a role. Rwanda is a very strong state these days, very much focused on development, but also allowing very little critical voice. So the arrest of journalists or the repression of critical voices is also very much present in Rwandan society and quite difficult to address, even for international actors. And this means that there is just very little freedom of speech, and there's no violence. So there's no violence. Considered as quite a safe country by, especially by international standards, but also you can walk around as in the night without having to worry too much. And those are quite surprising and remarkable things. But this is also because this police state is this authoritarian state is so strong and has a lot of military and police present in the streets. So it's protecting on the one hand, but it also means that there is very limited space for critical voices. And I think most of the intermingling of Rwanda in terms of conflict happens more across the borders and in geopolitical international fora. So within the country, there is not much conflict and violence, but also not much space for critical reflections and critical thoughts and critical ideas. But across the country, there are some troubles indeed with how Rwanda interferes internationally, and this sometimes does play a role in shaping the alliances between different countries and different movements. And right now, especially between Rwanda and DRC and Uganda, there are quite a few tensions. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, I understand.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Artanto atas pertanyaannya.
Terima kasih. Salam.
Saran Bu dari Bapak Ibu host. Jadi I suggest to also continuing this program. I think especially relating to the African studies is very important, because here in Indonesia less also called information about the African issues in terms of the academical point of view. So again, I suggest to bring for organizing for the next webinar and discussing other issues on the African situation like what we organized today. Thank you so much. Saran Bu untuk ke depan ada series yang kedua untuk mengadakan kegiatan ini. Let's say we organizing this like a webinar. We still have time up to the December, maybe in the next month or up to the November, December. We will organizing, let's say, once a month for the organizing webinar focusing on African issues. Thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Baik. Untuk webinar selanjutnya insya Allah akan kami informasikan lebih lanjut, karena memang rencananya ini akan terus ya. Ya, silakan selanjutnya apa Prof. Erika? Silakan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gede, for your inspiring speech, inspiring discussion about Burundi, and especially about intergenerational perspective facing peace and conflict. From what you have explained, we know that how memory and telling memory have a power to shape, to form activities, to form perception, to form practice of our behaviors in order to protect themselves and in order to face the situation, political condition of the Burundi. And also, we know from your presentation that there is dialogical process between memory and telling memory and changing political situation of Burundi from one period to another period. And but I want to know more about you have mentioned, you have noted some hello, you have cited some interview with informants, but I want to know more about which class, which informant did you want to interview, whether the informant from educated or not uneducated persons. That's one of my question. That is very inspiring. Very inspiring, especially for historian, how the process, dialogical process between memory, telling memory, what kind of memory tell to young generation, and how they memory protects, can shape the perception, can shape the behavior to changing political situation of Burundi. It is very inspiring. But then I want to know more about what kind of generation, what kind of generation that you interviewed, educated or uneducated?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the very good question on methodology. In the beginning, I showed you that I conducted research in various periods in time, starting in 2005 in a refugee camp, and then in 2007 in Burundi. When I first came to Burundi in 2007, I focused on doing research with young people in the northern neighborhood of the capital. And these were what they were calling the more crowded, popular neighborhoods where a lot of young people were living. So there were many young people there. Most of them did do primary school, because many young people in Bujumbura do go to primary school. My interlocutors were ones who spoke a little French, because that really facilitated access. I tried to work with translators, but this was quite challenging to build trust. So many of the interlocutors with whom I did research, they had some education, but very often also not full secondary education. So maybe the first years of secondary education, some of them had gone to university, but many of them had not, or maybe had tried 1 year of university and then had to stop because other life challenges or demands. So they had all some education, but were not necessarily highly educated, had not necessarily had the chance to finish their education. And at the time of my research with them, they were mostly identifying as youth. And for this particular paper, I focused on the interviews and conversations and exchanges I had with especially the male youth. These days, I'm still in contact with many of them, and many of them have become parents and fathers. So they are not necessarily, so they have received some education, but not necessarily highly educated. And they were living in more the poorer families, the poorer to maybe aspiring middle class, but not yet middle class. That's how I would describe them roughly, the majority of them.
Oh, thank you very much. But hello?
Yes.
Oh, hello. Are you going to do the same thing to Maluku's conflicts and violence?
Molokans.
I don't know. I'm exploring, but I would definitely not do the same because I want to focus more on what if I would be a medical or a psychological researcher, would call post-traumatic growth. So I'm more interested now into see how people who experience crisis grow from it or try to shape and make changes more positively in society. I think it is a story that I would rather tell, also to inspire others to tell things that go well, but it's also to keep myself a little bit in good spirits because seeing the cycles of violence and studying them is actually quite depressing.
Thank you very, very much, Lady Vedang, for your information.
Ya, baik, terima kasih. Untuk selanjutnya barangkali ada pertanyaan lain, silakan. Ada Prof. Cahyo barangkali ada, ya bisa ada apa comparison dengan because he has been studying conflict in Papua and Ambon.
Yes.
Oke.
Gak ke syuting, Mas.
Ya nggak apa-apa, tapi itu jauh nggak? Sepertinya nggak.
Sebentar.
Mbak Evi,
First of all, I would like to cite interesting presentation. I did not join from the earlier your presentation because I still driving and it's picture is heavy, so I could not concentrate on your presentation. But what I could capture in the class sharing is about the tension and conflict in Burundi. Yeah, more or less it's the chronology of the conflict from 1970s until the 2008 or 2006, 2005. I'm sorry. Maybe I just would like to ask you to more in detail in terms of intergroup relationship because in Burundi I am not clear yet because I don't read about literature for the Burundi, but maybe Rwanda still in conflict between Hutu and Tutsi, and yeah, it's around the colonization in 1960s in Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda. All of them are the former Belgium kingdom. From the conflict of phenomena in Burundi, in Rwanda, and around of the Central Africa. Maybe I just would like to emphasize on the ethnic boundaries, about ethnic boundaries, for example, like the majority and the minority relation. You have explained very well about the ethnogenesis, the formation of ethnic identities. Like what I read in Rwanda, that during the colonization of Belgium, I don't know about the Burundi. The Tutsi as a minority group become or we get more privileges. They are educated, more modernized than the majority of Rwanda. But when the colonization and Rwanda have independence, the minority Tutsi rule of the government, and the majority of Rwanda, the majority group Rwanda take action to exclude of the modernized Tutsi minority. So first of all, it's about the intergroup relation. after the independence or after the colonization. So the concept of nation state, I see it is not fit with the reality, because if we refer to Kelder or Ben Anderson, I think a Kelder is that a nation, a state should be dominated by one cultural unit or one ethnic group. This principle of nationalism is not fit because there are a lot of ethnic group, and from the ethnogenesis we saw that it is not clear cut boundaries like between Hutu and Tutsi. So would you like to describe? Would you like to share with us about the impact of colonialization, the legacy of colonialization in the past to the ethnogenesis, the formation of ethnic group in Burundi, and the secondly is about whether the democratic political system, the liberal democratic system, is effective to become the what we call as peace-building or conflict resolution in the poly-ethnic societies like in Africa. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, too long, too long prologue. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Cahyo.
Should I start answering?
Yeah, you can directly answer.
Okay. So I think the first point you make, or the first question you ask, is about the impact of colonization in the past on the ethnogenesis. What I think is important to realize that in Burundi and Rwanda, and between Hutus and Tutsis, it was never, it's been called ethnic group, but it's a different ethnic group than what you see in many other places in Africa. In Burundi and in Rwanda, Hutu and Tutsi share the same language, the same cultural practices to a large extent, and in many ways, it was more a category or a caste-like system, where there were differences in power. And this is also why if you go, for instance, to Rwanda, to the genocide by the Tutsi, they say, well, the colonial powers decided that anybody with 10 cows was a Tutsi and anybody with less were a Hutu. So there was this dimension also of the kind of task or duty you had, the kind of employment position you had in society. It was informing whether you were Hutu or Tutsi, to which clans you belong. Some were Hutu clans, some were Tutsi clans, some were mixed clans. So these, and what is important, I think, especially for Burundi to realize is that where in Rwanda there was much more clear an opposition between Hutu and Tutsi, and in Burundi the situation was more complex because the ruling class were Bagamwa, like the princely elites, which were not the same clans or not the same, considered the same ethnic group as the ethnic group Tutsi, the Tutsi Hima, who later came into power. But for the colonial rulers, there were Hutu, Tutsi, but the situation on the ground was much more complex. In Rwanda or in Burundi, at least three categories of different groups. And before colonization, clans were also very important, to which family clan you belonged. And I think there, colonization played a very important role and had a big impact. On the one hand, in making these categories more important, and on the other hand, making them more rigid. So, for instance, in Burundi, there was this concept where you would Tutsify yourself. If you would marry up, or if you would become rich and have many cows and much land, then you would become. There was a verb that was referring to this person has become a Tutsi. And now you see that this, in the colonial period, it was much more perceived, okay, these are ethnic groups. One comes from the north, and they make this link also with more biblical and racial ideas about people who are descended from the people of God, from the Bible, and other people who were then considered Hutu and of a lower class and with less possibilities. They were not so smart, and they were gullible. And so they had all these different ideas about making them much more, with a lot of racial perspectives on ranking of people and seeing that those people are better than others. So it very much fitted also with the European fascism, I would say, in those times where ideas became more stronger about racist differences. So this is what happened during the colonial period, and which meant also that after colonization, a lot of the politics and possibilities were framed along these ethnic lines, and the violence also. But whereas in the beginning of the violence in Rwanda was much more about struggle between two different clans and two different Tutsi groups, you can almost say, the Banyaruguru, people who were living on the highlands, and the Banya and the Tutsi Hima, who were living more in the south. There was also that tension that were actually taking place in these elite political struggles, rather than simply Hutu Tutsi. So that is, I think, an important difference also with Rwanda, but also making the situation much more complex to grasp. And with North and South, and with clan, and with, so there are a lot of different ways in which alliances were formed and shaped. And now your second, so this is quite different than also and it relates to your second question, where you say, well, these kind of democratic liberal systems, does it work in societies that are ethnically divided like this? Like if you see the Hutu are estimated to be about 84%, or the 85%, the Hutu, the Tutsi 14%, and then you have the indigenous population, Batwa, who are often forgotten, and also in my presentation did not get mentioned, but they are estimated to be about 1%. So how does it work in these electoral periods? And you do see that's why, for especially the majority, it's interesting to rally and to find votes by manipulating these ethnic differences. And that's where in 2015, the presentation that I was mentioning, there was a bit of confusion, because in the years after the war, there were a lot of interventions showing no, it's not the ethnic, and this is what a lot of people were telling me also, but very much integrated into the minds of young people. It's not the ethnic that kills, it's the politic that kills. It's not ethnicity that matters, it's political parties that are manipulating. But then there is room for doubt, because there was violence along ethnic lines. And you know that these can be manipulated. And then maybe tomorrow also there will be violence again around ethnic lines. So it's more difficult to trust someone of another ethnic group. So in a way, through these fears and this anticipation and through these memories of the past, these differences remain important. But it's not so much because they have different languages, different cultural practices, that there are really different ethnic groups like you have in some of the other countries. So it's quite easy to manipulate along these ethnic lines. And I think in Rwanda, well, it is a very authoritarian state, but I would be interested in what would happen because there they said, okay, we don't have ethnicity anymore, we only have Banyarwanda. I wonder if it really works that way because of the immense violence that took place, which makes it very difficult to erase those kind of divisions from society. But they are called democratic countries, but the question is whether this democratic system there in any case works the way they are intended or idealized to work. So I'm not so sure whether it's the ethnic composition that makes it challenging. It's also very much different ideas on what it means to be in power and what you are allowed and entitled to do and what kind of ruler you are. So it has very much to do with ideas about power and political authority, and maybe more even than having these different and uneven constituencies of ethnic backgrounds, I would think. How is that here?
Yes.
How is that here?
It's okay.
No.
I can understand your explanation. I just would like to learn from you about the situation in Africa, because I never read about it. But we live in the conflict area. Oh yeah, it's a different story.
Yeah.
Just now I shifting my studies about this conflict to the construction of identity, because the I am interested to develop how the concept of ethnicity is mentioned. I teach in anthropology department in the University of Indonesia because the ethnogenesis is very important. The formation of ethnic groups, the colonization, the migration and change, and the relation between ethnic group or between the state and the ethnic group in the nation state formation. So I see that what we call ethnic group or concept initiative, it is not based on the power or the community based on the same of the shared cultural trait or cultural stuff, but it is the ethnic group is it's resemblance like a political organization. It is created to reference to Jenkins. It is to pursuit of political interest. So it's just how we understand the concept of ethnic group, ethnicity, and nationalism in African or post-colonial context. Thank you very much for your explanation. And we learned a lot from you about the Burundi. State that we do know. But it's very important. Rwanda is like many other apologists writing about the copper belt, Mauritania and copper belt, like the Kanila dance in copper belt, Rhodesia. Which Rhodesia? I forget. Where is the Rhodesia? Oh, in Zimbabwe. Like the research on the copper belt in Rhodesia, the phenomena of detribalization and retribalization. So modernization in Africa, it does not mean to the melting of identity. So the identity, some of ethnic group become more salient. I think we can find everywhere. Every modernization, industrialization, migration, or even decolonialization, there is always detribalization, and in the other side is retribalization. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, this make longer. Terima kasih Bu Evi.
Okay.
Ini Pak Kuliah.
You want to know more about
I'm asking.
Okay. Anyone else wants to ask question or probably give comments or wants to discuss something related to what has been presented?
Okay. Maybe just to continue, since you already mentioned about the power relation, and Tayo also mentions about the development, and there's now a growing view about the developmental state with the rise of China, and it's become a model. That's you need a very strong political rulers, or maybe the president, and who can more than two periods. And you mentioned in Burundi, because of these 3 periods, it's become of this kind of conflict. But the idea of having more than 2 periods of presidency is now become more popular, I think, also particularly in Africa, including also in Rwanda, Uganda, and so on. Do you think this kind of having strong leaders will really have this ethnic fragmentations? For example, I don't know what happened in Rwanda after Kagame no longer president. Is it really successful, or you will say that it's just kind of another dictatorship?
I think it's a very good question. I also see that it's more popular, and in that sense, this model of liberal democracy, the 2 terms, the maximum, that's very much put in question. And I have to say myself, we have a democratic system, but I think our prime minister has been in power now 17 years, because it is a difference. It's no president, but it's so it's, you see, I don't know, this there's quite a lot to say about how in practice this model of democracy is working and is being popular or not. But what I do see is that in Rwanda is very much often praised, both nationally and internationally, like the Burundi news that I thought we were going to be like in Rwanda. It's now focusing on development. So it's very much seen as a country where there is investment in poverty, in reduction, in technology, in a national identity. So it's very much seen as if it is very helpful. And it's also an example in terms of you cannot have any plastic bags. So also environmentally is an example. It's in trying to implement now these electric scooters as a way to for the taxis, I would say, which Jakarta could also quite well use. I think so. You have quite a lot of things in which Rwanda is developing itself as an example, and also trying to show to the rest of the world that it's an example. But in reality, if you look, there has, since the 1990s, there has not been a lot of economic growth needed. And there is a lot of safety. The roads are really good. There are good hospitals, there are good universities. So there's a lot that is going quite well there. But overall, there's not a lot of economic growth. And the growth that is there, you can wonder what comes from Burundi and what comes from Rwanda and what is from also these international geopolitical struggles and interests in the DRC, for instance, and the mines and the gold and those kind of. So, and that's not really clear, and that's not really transparent. In terms of the population, it's now been peaceful for about 30 years, like a full generation, which is quite admiring in many ways. But there's a lot of fear of what will happen when Kagame passes away or when something happens and he's no longer there. There's not really any preparation for what comes after in terms of democracy or in terms of a new strong leader. So there's a lot of fear that there might be new violence, even though it has been quiet for such a long time. And even though now people have to speak about Banyarwanda. What happened in the aftermath is still, these tensions remain because there was such massive, this killing took place on such a massive scale, about a tenth of society, which also means that in the aftermath, there was a lot of, maybe you've heard of these transitional justice initiatives, the Gacaca courts, which are like a locally inspired, at the local level, courts to bring to justice those people who were participating in the violence. But it also meant that close to 1 million people were imprisoned, and some for up to 30 years. And they're now slowly being released, which also causes a lot of fear. And the families of those ex-prisoners, they hold their neighbors who accuse them accountable for not having a father present in their household or for having been forced to pay retributions for the land that they stole or the damage that was done during the genocide, which means that some of their children were not able to go to school because there wasn't money for school fees. So all those kind of small things continue to feed tensions and suspicions and mistrust within communities. So there is a lot of fear that when the strong leader is no longer there, that these old tensions might be revived again, as if they have never gone away. Yeah.
Okay, actually we have up to 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
But if anyone still have one more question or
The reason is about the narrative of violence.
The fear, what happens in the pandemic? Yeah.
This is about narrative of violence.
Like all the countries, it was kind of closed off. But they kind of negated that there was any problem for a long time. And even the president who went to the theater, he died. And there are rumors that maybe COVID, others say no, he was poisoned. So it's not clear, but officially there were not really any regulations for COVID. But now there are. So since since then there are, so you have to show COVID tests and everything. It doesn't seem like, surprisingly, it doesn't seem to have, there have been people dying, but it doesn't seem to have caused the great danger or troubles that were expected in Africa as were expected. So also in a lot of the African countries that I know, that I followed a little bit, it was especially the measures that were really suffocating to a lot of the people in terms of not being able to go to work and not being able to do their business and also as a possibility for for people in power to increase their grip and enforce their power on people. So yeah, but at the same time, there are not a lot of reliable numbers available on what it really is. But from what I heard also from people that I know, it was not their main concern. Poverty was a bit stronger, much more important concern.
Saja, oke, Mas Fajar. Terakhir.
Okay, just a quick question. You mentioned about narratives. Yeah, just kind of wondering what kind of we're talking about this, the process of healings and also traumatic kind of not kind of incident. How do people talk about the past and the trauma, and also how do people also talk about this the need for healing and so on? I'm just kind of wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on this kind of possible connection between this the narratives of trauma and also narratives of healing, and if there is a connection in how, and also if there is no connection, probably why, and then the other my other questions are connected to this kind of to this point is that how do people share the narratives? Was it through media, and what kind of media, and or probably through kind of public storytelling, or maybe healing session or something like that. Just kind of I'm kind of interested in the way how these different kinds of narratives circulate and sustain in the community or among the community.
Yeah. So the first question, I think, is a really interesting question, that how the narratives of trauma and how narratives of healing are connected or not. I don't dare to say, because we started the project really focusing on these, what I call them, the pedagogies of peace, in August. So we are still collecting, we are still working on it. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have to look at, whether and how these are connected. Are some families more focusing on the narratives of healing and others more on trauma, or do they coexist? Yeah. Are they part of the same story? That is something I think that we need to try and find out. But on the question on how they circulate and are sustained, I think if I look now at the example of Burundi, there was a lot of telling about the past. There were a lot of stories shared in a lot of seminars and public meetings organized by non-governmental organizations, by other kind of initiatives to talk about what happened in the past. But at the same time, these more public stories, which said it's not the ethnic that kills, were not necessarily the same stories or having the same content exactly as what was shared within families. So within families, there were different narratives that were being shared. It's complementary, sometimes contradictory other times. So to give an example, one girl, and I thought she expressed it more metaphorically, but quite nice. She said, when I go to the youth center, there was a youth center where I did my research in the neighborhood of, when I go to the youth center, I wear trousers. And for her, it symbolized I'm open to other ethnicities. I'm a girl, but I wear trousers. I'm modern. And when I go back home, I have to wear a skirt. So when I'm back home, I'm associated with Hutu Hafanel. I'm pro-Hutu. And for her, it was not so much a choice, but it was more she was an orphan. She had to accommodate what was expected from her. So when she was at home, she would go along with those narratives about ethnic difference, and that would say, well, the Tutsi did a really bad thing during the war, and we pro-Hutu, blah, blah, we have to. And then when she was in the youth center, she said, well, we're all the same, and she had friends. So it was quite, in that sense, a bit puzzling to me on how people could be so like chameleons, had to change their colors. And it was because these narratives circulated differently in these different spaces. And young people had to navigate those narratives in one space and the other. But this also means that they were familiar with the different types of narratives. And that when something happens, they had to make a decision. Okay, on which side do I belong in this sense?
I think this is what in my dissertation long time ago, something that I call the focalization of the narrative. So when you said that there's a moment, and then there is some, there is some moment when all of the narratives should focalize into certain kind of stories.
Yeah.
In my work on the urban riot narratives in 1998 riots, I found out that this kind of focalization was taking place around what I call a figure of the state. So when there is a discussion or there is a narrative of the state, and then all these different kinds of narrative focalize into a very clear narrative of state versus victim. So there's a moment when yes, you have a different kind of stories going on, circulation in the neighborhood, in the family, and so forth, in the media. But when there is a moment you need to talk about the state and the victim, then all of this narrative start to focalize into one kind of I will not say truth, but one kind of narrative. So this is quite interesting for me because it is not only verbally taking place, but also visually taking place. Because when you're talking, when you see for example, the presentation of media and the television about the riots, 1990 riots, then you can see very clear plan to use this technology of television camera and use the different kinds of mailing lists at the time to focalize the narrative into the kind of clear-cut agencies, state victims.
Yeah.
So for me, it kind of interest at that time. I was kind of really interested in looking at these processes, and that was also, I think, one of the book I forgot on the Rwanda conflict also making the same kind of a point, in which there is a certain moment that you have to be Hutu, and there is a certain moment that you have to be Hutu versus the other ethnic groups, and there's a certain moment that you kind of have to mingle. So, but that is a kind of book published probably a long time ago. Yeah, just kind of wondering about this same kind of a process, whether it's still going on.
Yeah, I think it is still very relevant, at least what I saw also in 2015, when within a couple of weeks, people were adjusting their narratives and the way they behave. And Yeah, for instance, you one young man that I known for a very long time that come from a mixed background. He was never involved in politics. His family was able to have him free all the time because he was separated from father and mother because of his different ethnic background. And then in this period, he was a young man, not employed, living next to Hutu militia. He said, why are you not helping us? Whereas he looks much more like Tutsi, and he was living often with his mother, who was Tutsi. But he aligned and participated in these youth groups. And in the beginning, to the family, it was shocking. And then they said, no, they changed the narrative. It's for the state, he's patriotic. He is. Yeah. So it's also, people are very flexible in how these narratives, and there is a moment in which it's like a critical moment where people have to adjust to something that becomes dominant narrative. But what I'm interested in what these moments are, and they are partly framed around these elections, right? There are partly moments that are more structurally organized in a way, but they're also, what I'm also interested in whether then, if people could choose otherwise, because now everybody, it works because everybody buys into or contributes to focalizing these messages. But if other ordinary people could do otherwise, if there's enough support for otherwise, could there be a different outcome then rather than this outcome of violence?
Do you think the involvement of the international NGOs, organizations like Human Rights Watch or International Transitional Justice Network also shape this kind of moment? Because I found that in Indonesian case in my work at that time, this is the role of these NGOs, international NGOs, very much important in the way how they shape this moment of the narrative. So you're not allowed to speak as yourself, but you have to be part of a certain category that is defined by the whole human rights, dynamics of the human rights. Do you think that is also the case in?
Yeah, but different roles and different times. I think in the post-war period, the NGOs contributed very strongly to narratives saying that it's not the ethnic that kills, but rather the politics. So they contributed very much to that idea of that it was more related to politics than to ethnic difference. And what they also did is they enabled a lot of international media, which was more free to share stories, more critical stories, so not only the official, more state narratives. And of course, it's not completely like these were often, but these international free journalists, they became seen as the opposition, the political opposition. And many of them were also Tutsi, maybe because of the history of education and opportunities, but also because of government jobs sometimes being more difficult to obtain. So they became like, during the post-war, they had a lot of space to advocate these alternative narratives. But when in 2015, a lot of them had to flee. Some of the radio stations were burned down, others were closed. And this meant that they were effectively opposition and that everything that they had said was kind of suppressed also. So, yeah, it's not black and white, but of course the international community had a very important shaping role. But what they did well really has very much limits. And this was very visible in 2015 that whatever this internationally brokered peace agreement was, had its very strong limits. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. It's now 11:16, so we have already passed 16 minutes from the time set. So, okay, anyone? Okay, yeah, I think we can just close this webinar, and yeah, I think it's a very interesting discussion we have today. The conflict, violence, and the cycle of violence, memories, and blurring boundaries and other kind of things related to generational perceptions of conflict. So I would like to thank you to you all that you have joined this webinar. And probably Mas Helmi wants to inform about the next series.
So thank you very much, leader, for the very nice presentations, and also for the experience. Actually, this is the kick-off seminars of the African Roots webinar series. Yeah. For the next seminars, maybe will be about 3 weekly or 2 weekly periods, and will be the presenters will be from Indonesia, from the Netherlands, and also from the Africa. So we will try to always have these seminars, at least for 3 weeks for this series, and we hope we can dig deeper, not only in the surface. We need to know Africa up to the roots, not only what we can see on the ground. Yeah? So please, hopefully you can also always participate in this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I
Okay, so see you for this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Baik, saya
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu, thank you so much.
Terima kasih Pak Asanto.
Sama-sama ya.
Seminar.
Terima kasih
Terima
Pak.
kasih ya.
Iya.
Ibu Erlisa.
Sampai
Terima
nanti
kasih.
mudah-mudahan.
Ya, insya Allah.
Atau Bapak bisa mengisi juga?
Ya Bu, nanti ya baik, nanti kita bisa koordinasikan Bu. Jadi apa namanya, penting sekali karena apa namanya kan Afrika ini jarang khususnya Bu ya, pada diskusi padahal kan investasi Indonesia itu di Afrika itu kan paling besar ya Bu ya. Jadi sebetulnya dari aspek strategis kajian dari BRIN bisa memberikan nanti bisa digabungkan dengan dengan update Bu ya, update sekarang maksudnya yang kaitan dengan yang dari ministry, dari kementerian begitu. Nah, jadi memang kan sekarang itu kan investasi Indonesia yang paling besar itu sebetulnya di Afrika. Ada di Nigeria itu ada 10 perusahaan lebih Bu.
Masih ngobrol.
Boleh kami dapat nomor kontak Bapak?
Iya baik, nanti saya ini kirim sampai ke Mas Helmi Bu ya Bu ya. Ini iya Pak Helmi sudah ada ya. Begitu Bu.
Mas
Jadi
Helmi ada ya.
Ada ya. Jadi apa? Ya, saya dulu juga di Legnas LIPI Bu dulu sebelum masuk Bu ya. Ya jadi ini di rumah sendiri. Ya. Jadi ulangi lagi Bu Erwisa. Jadi memang untuk Afrika ini kan memang jarang kita yang fokus ke sana ya, baik kementerian lembaga ataupun semualah kajian-kajian. Orang kan tahunya kan Amerika, Eropa itu kan ya, Australia. Padahal Afrika itu secara realnya kenyataannya itu investasi kita paling besar di Afrika. Itu ada 10 pabrik di Nigeria itu ada Indo. Ya memang ada milik kita, ada juga yang share joint venture gitu seperti Indomie, kemudian Tempo, Kalbe Farma dan macam-macam lah Bu itu ada
dan kerjasama juga dengan
kerjasama
Gorontalo,
dan juga
Zanzibar, Gorontalo masalah pembangunan.
Ya itu semacam gitu kan, itu kan harus bisa bisa dimunculkan lagi gitu. Jadi isu mengenai Afrika ini juga makanya terutama nanti juga masalah dikaitkan dengan yang basic kan, yang dasar ya seperti ini tadi kan masalah root Afrika secara budaya. Tapi paling tidak untuk untuk isu-isu Afrika memang kalau bisa dimunculkan lagi memang bagus. Jadi apa namanya fokus kita sebetulnya ke arah ke sana sebetulnya. Mungkin setelah pandemi itu aja kan kita menurunkan Bu ya. Iya. Baik, Bu Ersha, terima kasih, sampai ketemu lagi nanti.
Pak.
Sama-sama sama teman-teman di
Terima kasih
BRIN
banyak.
ya.
Ya, nanti kita campurkan antara
Iya, baik. Ya, jadi saran Bu, jadi ada pertemuan itu kalau enggak katakanlah sebulan sekali gitu Bu ya. Jadi nanti apa namanya bisa rutin. Ini kan series pertama, nanti mungkin series kedua, ketiga, dan nanti monggo bisa dibicarakan lagi. Mungkin bisa sharing nanti saya mengenai apa begitu. Tapi yang penting di seriesnya jangan berhenti karena memang ini pas pandemi, selesai pandemi itu Bang berhenti sama sekali. Mungkin bukan hanya di Afrika, tapi itu Afrika ini penting karena itu tadi masalah investasi Indonesia di sana itu paling besar di luar negeri sebetulnya, tapi nggak nampak begitu. Jadi
sebetulnya juga teman-teman kami kan bisa juga presentasi hasil penelitian sama ini.
Iya, ada penelitian itu. Jadi ada update-nya dari gabungan dari yang mengenai kajian akademis, kemudian itu kan ditambah nanti misalkan ada best practices dari yang diundang segala macam untuk menceritakan update mengenai khususnya yang terkait dengan Indonesia di sana. Baik Bu, terima kasih. Baik teman-teman, sama-sama. Assalamualaikum.
Baik, terima kasih semuanya. Saya tutup ya.
Iya, baik. Makasih Pak. Makasih Pak.
Terima kasih banyak Pak.
Stigmatization and